everyone seems to be worried about inflation right now. It is kind of the perfect storm of raw input costs rising, transportation costs rising, labor costs rising, et cetera.
That's Shawn O'Brien, an associate partner in our commercial excellence practice here at Bain & Company. He specializes in pricing strategies, and he's uniquely positioned to help our clients navigate an inflationary climate unlike anything they've seen before.
While it's scary for a lot of funds, it's enlightening for them to see the role that price can play to help counteract that.
Today on the show, Shawn O'Brien will describe how private equity houses are moving beyond their usual cost-cutting playbook and developing pricing strategies that can withstand an inflationary storm.
I think it's opening a broader dialogue around price being a core part of the value creation plan.
I'm Hugh MacArthur, head of Bain's global private equity practice, and this is Dry Powder. So Shawn, welcome to the show and thanks for stopping by today.
Thanks for having me.
Love to get your take in the beginning on how you see clients are reacting to these historic inflation rates, things we haven't seen in for 40 years. And are they still absorbing this news, or are people actually doing things?
Yeah, we're seeing scenarios where a lot of people are a little bit in catch-up mode. In fact, I just got off a discussion a little bit earlier today with a client that saw a massive charge from one of their major suppliers. It feels like a lot of these management teams have just never dealt with this level of inflationary pressure before. I mean, I think the last time we saw this was the 70s or 80s. If you do the math and walk backwards, many of the people that were in business at that time, newly out of college, are now 60, 70 years old and not necessarily adept to dealing with this. From a cost playbook perspective, a lot of firms are falling back on the playbooks that they're used to running, and they're looking deep within their supply chain. They're thinking about how to monitor and reduce consumption, all those kind of levers. But from a price perspective, this is where we're seeing a lot of clients start to look and see, how do we think strategically about passing this on? Is there an opportunity not only to cover the pressure that we're seeing, but expand margins through inflation and everyone essentially expecting some of these increases to come through? Part of the challenge is if you're going to do an inflationary price increase, you're going to likely communicate it that way to your customers, whether you're in the B2B space and you're talking directly with customers, whether you're in a retail space and you're dealing with your retailers and they're dealing with their own pressures and their own problems. It's not necessarily easy.
I've heard that the first price increase is really a critically important decision. Why is that true, and how does one think about it?
I think what we've seen is a couple clients kind of moved early on and didn't take enough. And they were successful in passing through a price increase, and it was a little bit of a bloody battle. But now, as the cost pressures continue to rise, I think some people have gone back for a second bite and are finding the door is closed. 3 to 6 months later, they're already realizing they didn't take enough price. Their margins are starting to compress further, and it's just hard to go back within that time period and ask for a second favor.
So while gas stations seem to have no problem raising my prices whenever they want, for a lot of other businesses, it can be more challenging.
Exactly. And especially like in a B2B space where, depending on your contract terms and when the point of renewals are, for a lot of businesses, they might only be able to adjust price 5, 10, 15%. I just had a client pass through almost 17% in inflation to one of their core customer segments.
Wow.
You can only do that one time a year.
Yeah, 17% you wouldn't want to do more than once. I also know that the ability to increase price varies from industry to industry, and I suspect it also varies by where you sit within a given industry in terms of your leadership position, your market share, those kinds of things. How does a private equity firm actually go about assessing the pricing opportunities for a given portfolio company?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what's KKR call it price makers and price takers, and just thinking about whether or not you have the opportunity to take advantage of the pressures and price against it. When we work with clients, we do a 3-step approach. First, we're going to look at their portfolio and just say, what is the price floor that you're even going to run into? Depending on the type of business, if you're a largely service business and labor driven versus if you're, say, in the commodity space and largely input driven, what do we think the indices are saying? Because everyone can see the indices and you can communicate clearly to where they're going. And if you apply those indices against the kind of weighting of your goods of services, what would it say the floor is that you need to cover from an inflation perspective to push? And that floor is going to vary a ton of different ways. One of my clients I've been working with actually operates in the B2B, the B2C, and the retail space. So they're across a bunch of different sectors. And actually, even within their portfolio of businesses, some businesses are faring quite well because they have less exposure to some of the core drivers of inflation, and other ones are actually struggling a ton. And so just understanding what the raw inputs are, how it's going to impact the cost pressure, and then how much pricing power you have when you think about your positioning in the market, how competitive the market is, et cetera, is the first step that we typically work to figure out.
And how granular should that assessment actually get?
Usually we'll start at the highest level at the portfolio level. So we'll look at a business unit and just say, across products and services, what are the primary drivers of inflation and what would they see or say? But actually very quickly, we end up getting down actually to our product level. And the one example that we just wrapped up, the one that was operating across kind of B2B, B2C, and retail, we started at the highest level at a business unit and said, what are your kind of 3 to 5 primary drivers of cost? And then we quickly actually boiled it down to product category level. So understanding what segments, what products, et cetera. And we actually got down to the SKU level for the few SKUs that we could hang the rest of the portfolio on and actually communicate very clearly, because ultimately you're still going to have to pass this through, communicate very clearly what the cost pressures are and why they're driving the need to drive price.
I like this whole notion you described, Shawn, of price makers and price takers. And I remember years ago, I had the opportunity to sit on the board of a private equity owned retail business. It was actually a pizza business. And we had a huge spike in commodity prices at the time. I remember there was a record price for wheat, record price for cheese, record price for meat. And, what are the 3 main ingredients of a pizza? It's wheat and cheese and meat. And we actually had very limited opportunities to price up unless the market leaders in pizza chains nationally did that. So we were more price takers than price makers. But what we had to do was figure out how to forward buy these commodities in an intelligent way to be able to fix our cost and know what that was actually going to be going forward. And it took us a few months to figure out that was the right strategy.
Yeah.
You're talking about a much deeper level of granularity and a much deeper level of analysis. How quickly do leading firms actually go through these types of analytics on what can we do on pricing and how, and then arrive at a decision and actually put it into place?
The client that I was just talking through is actually a market leader. And there was a little bit of trepidation when we first started saying, okay, well, what are our competitors doing? Are they increasing price? And if they're not increasing price, I'm not sure I'm confident to push and do it myself. And there actually needs to be a part of the dialogue around that exact point, which is, first off, whether or not they have taken price yet, they are facing the same pressure as you are, and you're going to have to push, and we would expect them to do so. And to be honest, the second you take the price, they're going to follow. So if you're worried about pricing yourself even higher from outside of your core positioning, you're the market leader, everyone's going to signal and follow. But back to the point on how long does this take? We went through 20 plus businesses globally, every major continent, every major market. It took around 2 to 3 months to assess every business unit down to a product category level, and in some cases down to a SKU level. And actually that process that I described around establishing the floor, so figuring out what the pressure is actually going to be, establishing what we call the ceiling in the process, which is actually beyond the pressure of inflation. If we just look at competitor actions and historical price gaps, the product value and customer price sensitivity and product differentiation and all those kind of things, do we actually price even higher than what inflation is going to say so that we can actually get some margin expansion as we go through this process? And then the kind of what I'll call the negotiation process with the business unit heads to say, okay, we know we have to at least cover the floor, so you don't have a choice. How much can we push above the floor to be able to communicate some margin expansion opportunity and pass through? That process took 2 to 3 months. So it could actually happen pretty quick.
2 to 3 months to actually implement.
Yeah, so 2 to 3 months we arrived. We went from no idea to what the actual cost pressure was going to be to actual pricing actions locked in. And then about a month or 2 of deployment thereafter. So actually thinking about customer communications letters. So we looked at 50 or 60 different communications that had gone out into the market around how people were announcing price increases to their customers, and just isolating down, what are the data points that are most effective? What's the messaging that's most effective? How do you actually do it in a way that people buy into and actually believe and continue to want to support your brand versus actually walk away because they feel like you're unjustifiably passing things on?
I can imagine this makes management teams in some companies a little bit nervous. I mean, we have a little bit of a, going back to your earlier comment, Shawn, a little bit of a prisoner's dilemma here, at least potentially on management's mind, where if I don't take price and others do, maybe I gain share, if that's at an attractive margin. If I take price and others don't, maybe I lose share. If we all take price, which obviously is a one-by-one decision, then that could be the best thing. But you're talking about not just taking price, but taking price potentially above the floor so that you could actually expand margins and hopefully hold share. What are the reactions that you might expect from management teams when you have those kinds of conversations?
Well, I mean, I mentioned, hey, in one of those businesses where 17%, give or take, and a lot of businesses in the 10 to 15% range, which sounds like a lot. I mean, depending on the industry you're in, particularly say if you're in consumer products, sometimes a 15% price increase is 50 cents or a buck on an actual SKU, which even ties back to a conversation I was having this morning with a client that's in the retail space. And so some of it is actually turning the percents into the practical implications of what someone's going to see on a shelf, or what is actually going to end up playing through on, say, a capitalized piece of equipment that is on a 3-year contract that you're passing something through and isn't going to actually have as big of an impact for what a customer sees on a monthly basis. The other one is the ability to create a little bit of transparency and competition within the firm. And what I mean by that is we have had plenty of either business unit GMs or CEOs or otherwise say, you know what, I'm not really comfortable taking price. And amazingly, when you take and literally create a simple bar chart where you compare each business unit across from one another and say, listen, here's the floor that is actually adjusted for your product mix and your cost mix. Here's how much you're going to take, and here's your ceiling, and here's where you're falling between those two. We found it actually really effective within a portfolio to stack those businesses up one-to-one. And it's amazing how the ones that are not at least covering the floor or at the floor push higher after another round. It takes a little bit of confidence building to see that others are having success with it and have confidence in doing it.
So it's helpful to both change the conversation sometimes from percentages that sound scary to dollars and cents that may actually not be that meaningful to the end customer, but also put into context of where a company is versus others, and feeling like if you're not getting on with it and others are, that you might be falling behind and actually underperforming.
Yeah, exactly.
So aside from the analytics, which are fascinating, and I can imagine get you to the point of saying, okay, we need to take a price increase, is the management team really going to be persuaded by that data alone? I imagine with a lot of management teams who aren't used to taking price increases, how they actually go about doing that is a challenge for them. Is there a change management issue in here that needs to be addressed?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, even if you get the executive team on board, you still need to get sales and customers, et cetera, on board as well. So I mentioned, looking at the price increase letters and figuring out that the fact that like being incredibly short, factual, focused, and tying a price increase to being able to continue to deliver an exceptional customer experience is much better than just saying, hey, we've got cost pressure and we have to pass it on to you. It actually has a completely different way of both customers perceiving it. And then from a sales perspective, I mentioned that 1 to 2 months of deployment after the kind of 2 to 3 months of landing on an answer and getting buy-in and finance sign off. That 1 to 2 months, the reason it takes that amount of time is it's actually building the playbooks. If you're in the retail space, here's how you're going to introduce it to your retailer. Here's the expected pushback we're going to get. Here's how you want to set your kind of minimum acceptable price or your kind of cross-platform prices if you're omni-channel. If you've got a direct B2B sales force out in the field, actually talking them through kind of here's the playbook or here's the sales play around how not only for existing clients, you're going to go back to them and have the conversation and adjust the contracts, et cetera. But then for new sales, honestly, not even talking about the price increase. Just the increase is set in the market and it's business as usual. And so it actually varies a lot as you go through. And one of the things we found helpful is, particularly when you make the jump from, say, the executive team down to sales, is the same story that you're using with your customers, you're using with your salespeople, tying it right back to margin, tying it right back to their incentives and comp, tying it right back to why we need to do it.
So similar to the development of cost playbooks that we talked about at the outset, you're talking about a very structured approach and a pricing playbook that really resonates throughout the entire organization.
Yep, exactly. And that playbook essentially, once again, ties back to a few basic steps. It's figure out the range of pricing actions that the business needs to take, tied to the actual cost pressures they're going to see, and adjust it as far up to the ceiling as what they could actually take in the market. Every consumer by this point has the understanding that inflation is here and it's starting to impact our everyday lives. The second step is kind of figuring out the specific actions you're going to take. So what are the price adjustments you're going to make by channel, by segment, by geography? The third step is essentially preparing the teams for launch. So making sure that the commercial teams are ready to go to have the conversations, et cetera. And then the fourth, to be honest, is because the point we kicked off with is nobody knows how far this is going to go and when it'll stop and how it'll perform and the impact on churn and all the other different things you have to consider. is establishing robust kind of tracking dashboards, metrics, et cetera, to be able to understand, are the actions that we're taking sticking? Is inflation actually arising above that we potentially need to take a second round and plan for 6 months to 12 months down the road? And if in the bad case, maybe churn or volumes are dipping because maybe you took too much price, do we need to add in promotional activity or otherwise to adjust?
On the next episode of Dry Powder, I'll ask Shawn O'Brien how private equity firms are building dashboards to track inflationary pressures across the portfolio.
The most effective firms I've seen are applying learnings from one portfolio company to another.
I'm Hugh MacArthur. Thank you for listening.